Kimberly and Christy, we're your presenters for today, and we're really thrilled that you joined us on Zoom to talk about literature reviews. So go ahead, Christy.
I will get us started here. So we'd love for you to engage with just a quick free write, if you will, to start. And so here's the reasons why we think free writes are important. The main challenge with literature reviews especially is that blank page syndrome, right? You have so much information, you've read so much, and you have to start writing, and it's impossible to start. It's just so intimidating. And so the process of creating language just freely, just writing things down as they come to you, as messy as it can be, and doing that for a sustained time really helps to start generating thought that will make the writing process easier. So here's what we'd like you to do. If you would pull up the chat box, and we're going to ask you to type for 2 minutes on one of these questions, but don't hit enter yet. We're going to do that Zoom thing where this is a pretty good sized group. And so we want to be able to see everyone's thoughts and not get distracted. So we're going to type, and then I'll tell you when to hit enter. Okay. So please pick one of these questions to spend, we'll probably actually do like 90 seconds, to spend a 90-second section of free write time on. You might want to write about what the purpose of a literature review is. So why do we do these? What's the purpose of it, right? You might instead choose to think about what components a literature review contains. And then hopefully you'll also start to think about what process you take when you start a literature review all the way through completing a literature review. So pick one of these questions to start with, and I'm going to start my timer. And if you'll just type in the chat box, if the time is still going and you ran out of things to say, move on to the next question. Write as much as you can about this just to get the juices flowing. So I will set my timer now. You will pick a question, but don't hit enter yet. Thank you. Go for it. If you're just joining us, we're writing about one of these questions in the chat, but we're not hitting enter yet. Keep going. You will take about 20 seconds to finish your sentence. And I will count down 3, 2, 1, go. Hit enter. Let's take a second to read the chat. So we'll let it keep populating till it slows down a little bit. All right, so take a second to read the chat and see what we notice here.
And as you do that, I'm going to pull out some of the things that I've noticed as well. I really like that I've seen a couple people talk about identifying the gap. And yes, I think that's a big part of literature reviews. We want to do original research. So finding that gap is always really exciting. And if someone else finds it for us, that's even better.
Yes, and I also like on that topic that someone wrote that there are different purposes depending on what your project is. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today, that a literature review is not a one-size-fits-all sort of endeavor. On process, I really like that people are thinking about things like annotated bibliographies, figuring out how to organize sources and ideas so that when you start writing, sort of you don't have that blank page syndrome. It's great.
I'm seeing a lot of really good things here, several components. Sometimes it's focused and planned, and I think that's absolutely true. But I think it's also true sometimes that as you're going, your topic changes. Just like any good research, when you're doing the research, sometimes you find things that you weren't expecting and it evolves as you go. I've had that happen. And sometimes it's really exciting. Sometimes it's really frustrating because you think you're doing one thing and then you're like, nope, before I do that thing, I have to do this other thing. But yeah, it can kind of be all over the place.
And on that note, Kimberly, one more comment on the free write. So sometimes the free write can help us after we've read a bunch of papers or read a bunch of the research, really sit down and just write for a while about what we've noticed, things that are interesting, these new ideas that have come up. So I like to start my free writing at like a 5 minutes of sustained writing of I'm just going to write for 5 minutes. And then as I go throughout the project or throughout the semester, challenge myself to 10 minutes maybe, or even 15 minutes. And sometimes that ends up being really usable. In fact, I wrote my dissertation in like 20-minute free write bursts where I just got everything out and then went back and took those ideas and developed them more in more depth. So I think that this process can be really useful in all of these parts of the literature review, from beginning it through the writing process as well.
And a few other people have mentioned this as well, but another big piece of literature review is to provide context. And different people use different terms to discuss that, but to give that context, so when someone is reading your paper, and when they come across a paper and they come across your research, they understand how it fits into the field of literature as a whole. So I think we're good here, and I'm going to go move on. And I want to kind of take a moment to define the literature review. We asked this question, but I really think it's important to dig a little bit more into this, because in academia, we use the phrase literature review very liberally, and we don't always mean the same thing when we say it. So I kind of want to define the different kinds of literature reviews that exist out there that you might be considering writing, or if you're a student that your professor might be asking for. So there's really three main types of literature reviews. The first one is article background. Almost every academic article you come across has that first section that's a background. Sometimes it's called an introduction, sometimes it's called a literature review, sometimes it's called background. Sometimes the author just jumps right in and doesn't have an actual heading for that section, but it's always the section that has a ton of citations. And again, this is providing the context for the research that you read later in the article. Our research does not exist in a void. Scholarship is a conversation. We're participating in that conversation by reading and writing, but it's not just a single piece of information. So this background gives the reader the information they need to understand what's happening in the research later. So that's kind of the first type of literature review. It's that background piece. It's the first part of an article. The second kind is called a review article. And this is really a unique type of publication, because review articles don't create or bring new information into the equation. They're just looking at existing literature that's already out there. Now, they may draw new conclusions because they're analyzing the information that's already out there, but they're not bringing new data or new details into the topic. So the whole paper is a review. You don't get, again, that original, like if we've done a survey or if we've done work in a lab, the whole paper is a synthesis and analysis of literature that already exists in the field. And there's three kinds of these, and that's kind of what that graph on the side to the right you're seeing is about. There's the big circle, which is literature reviews. This is very generic, and a literature review is just going to say, here's all the research that I could find on this topic, make of it what you will. It's really just going to be a relatively short paper, typically saying like, I read all these articles, I condensed it all for you, here are some of the big themes that I came across, now you have it. A systematic review is a type of literature review. So it's still trying to overview that whole field, but it also is going to analyze the results and tell you what it means. So, okay, I looked at this whole piece of this whole field of literature, I've condensed it down, and here's what I found. So if we were running a medical trial, here's what worked, here's what didn't. All these articles talk about this one particular medication. And when you've got 20 of them, what we find is it's more likely than not to be effective, or something else along those lines. So it's going to analyze all of the different articles that are out there and try to come up with a systematic way to compare them. This can be really difficult because in psychology, for example, you might have one person who's using Beck's depression inventory and another person who's using an anxiety scale. And how do you compare those two? So it's the author's job to say, okay, well, we've got these different systems of measurement and these different units. How do we put them together and actually come up with a conclusion? So a systematic review is a lot more in depth than just a generic literature review. Our third type here is a meta-analysis. And meta-analyses are systematic reviews, but they're very data heavy. They're number driven. They're going to have a lot of statistical inferences. So they're going to say, here's the information, here's what it means in this number form. So this medicine is more likely than not to work by a margin of, some percentage. So it's going to be much more in-depth, numerically and statistically driven. So that's kind of your review article. Then the third one we have here on this slide is dissertation background. And these are unique because they're kind of a combination of the first two. They're providing the context. So when a reader comes across the dissertation, they understand the field, they understand why the research is important and how it fits into the field, but it also needs to be comprehensive. So this number two, the review article, is really trying to be comprehensive. It's trying to get the whole field. And a dissertation background needs to do that because you're making the argument that you've seen the whole field, you've looked at the whole field, and your research is original because it hasn't been done in the field before. So it's kind of a combination of those first two pieces, if that makes sense. So with that in mind, I want to take a second, and in the chat, I would love for you to tell us which kind of literature review you're most interested in learning about, or that you're planning on writing, that you're planning to put together. Are you looking for article backgrounds? Are you looking for writing a review article like a systematic review? Or are you looking to write a dissertation? And it can be more than one of those. So go ahead, and you don't have to wait to hit enter this time, just go ahead and stick it in, and we'll kind of focus the direction of what we talk about based on what we're seeing. So I'm seeing a couple of systematic reviews, multiple people saying dissertation, good. Systematic review, it seems like it's pretty even between systematic and dissertation. Review article, okay. Good, that's good to know. So we won't spend as much time on the background piece. We'll look more at the specifics of systematic and dissertation, which means we're looking more at how to be comprehensive in our research. So that is good to know. All right, which brings us to actually searching and documenting. And since we're wanting to be comprehensive, I really want to take a second and focus on this. Literature reviews, like systematic reviews, like dissertations, when you want to be comprehensive, you have to track how you're doing it. Because like any research, you want your findings to be recreatable. You want another researcher to be able to come in, do the same things you did, and get the same results. And so they have to be able to duplicate whatever you're doing. And that means creating a search string where you keep track of the terms that you're using, the language that you're using, where you're searching, how many results you're finding, and all of those little bits and pieces. If you read a systematic review, the methodology section literally is that like boring. I'm a librarian, I'm allowed to say it. It's boring, it's a search string. Like you're putting in, here's the language that I used. I looked at PsycInfo, Medline, and Scopus, and I found 5,700 results. And out of those, I used 32 because. So that's the methodology for a systematic review, or for a meta-analysis as well. And usually for that whole review article section, number two. Sometimes you see this in dissertations as well, but it's not quite as much of the focus of the methodology. So again, there's a huge focus on reproducibility. Part of that includes criteria. This is usually broken down in methodology to inclusion and exclusion criteria, which are two sides of the same coin. So for example, I might say my criteria for inclusion is I'm only looking at studies from 2010 on, which would mean my exclusion criteria is everything before 2010. If that makes sense. So I've got my inclusion and exclusion. Another one that I use pretty frequently as an example would be if you're looking at something in the United States, if you're looking, I did a systematic review on mass incarceration at one point, and we were looking specifically at systems of incarceration in the United States because it's different between different countries. So our inclusion criteria was in the United States, and our exclusion criteria was looking at prison systems in any other country because we were focusing specifically on a geographic region. So you'll have all sorts of these criteria. Date range is a really common one. Whether or not you're looking at peer-reviewed articles is a really common one. Geographic region, age group, all of those little pieces might be part of your criteria. And the last part of that is going to be something called a citation management tool. If you're not familiar, Mendeley and Zotero are the two big ones that we really work with at the libraries. EndNote is kind of the third one that people know about, but it's not free, and I'm a librarian, so I want you to use free tools. So I'm gonna talk about Mendeley and Zotero instead. And these are tools that keep track of all of the articles you come across. And then the ones that you use, it will write into your bibliography for you. So it saves a lot of time, it saves a lot of effort. You don't have to write a bibliography. And for me, that's kind of best case scenario. So I am going to leave our slide deck here and switch over to the library's website because I want to do a couple hands-on things so that you can see the actual functionality of it. I'm going to be using this gray search bar as an example, but for that comprehensive piece, you would never use this gray search bar, even though it says comprehensive. Ignore that, it's a lie. It doesn't actually work that way. It looks at a lot of different materials, but it is a search that is unique to MU and could not be recreated by a researcher anywhere else. It's also going to pull things from some databases, but it's provided by one vendor, so it leans very heavily toward the materials from that vendor. So what you want to do when you're being comprehensive is find a couple subject databases. Like if I'm doing a psychology topic, I would probably look at a psychology database, an education database, a medical database. You want to pull in different pieces from these different areas that would overlap and be interdisciplinary. But again, you want it to be that specific database name so that another researcher coming in could go to that database and run the same search and find the same things. So this is a good example place that I'm going to be using in this gray search bar, but it's not where you would run a search for systematic review. I'm going to hit enter right away because I want to get into the actual search capabilities. And this is going to look the same no matter what database you're in. All of them are pretty standardized in terms of how they work and how they operate. You'll notice that as soon as I do this, I get this welcome guest, please log in for full access. I'm not on campus, so I'm going to log in. That's always the first thing I would recommend doing. This is going to give you the ability to actually access all of the materials that you come across rather than just see the record and then hit, a paywall. So I've logged in on this computer before, it recognizes me, but your login is your pop written password, the same thing that you use to get into MyZoo, MyHR, your email, etc. And we get these multiple fields. And I really like to point this out because the search is trying to convince you to build that search string that we talked about. And once you have created a search string, you're going to use the same terms and the same string in every database, because again, you want it to be recreatable. And if you're not familiar with how to create a search string, come talk to your librarians. We love creating these. It's part of our job. Again, I partner with faculty on writing systematic reviews frequently. So do all of my colleagues. So we're very familiar with this piece of the creation process. So come talk to us. We love it. But a couple tricks just to know about. I'm going to use an example of a paper that I'm writing right now and working on, which is looking at the digital divide in times of COVID pandemics and how libraries are addressing that. It's a pretty easy topic to expand upon. So we've got our terms, the digital, it helps if I can talk and type at the same time, but I can't. So we've got the digital divide, we have COVID, and we have libraries. You'll notice that I'm putting each of these terms on a different line because this and between the lines acts like a Venn diagram. It forces the overlap between the terms, which is really nice. If I wrote this all out on one line like you would in Google, like digital divide, COVID, and libraries, I would still find results, but I would not find all the results out there because sometimes it would focus on this part, sometimes it would focus on the other part, and it would also only use these terms. And if we want to be comprehensive, we have to look at all the other terms that an author might use as well. So for the and being the overlap piece, the flip side of that coin is or, which is going to expand out our search. It's going to find those alternate terminology pieces that might be out there. So since I've done this search, I know the terms are digital divide, digital inequality, digital inclusion, and digital exclusion. Again, just an example. I'm going to go back and put or between all of those, which I should have done at the beginning. It would have made things a little easier. Okay, so you can see it gets kind of messy. I often will write this down longhand on a piece of paper while I'm brainstorming, and I'll, Google different terms. I'll look at different articles and see what language is being used in the field before I actually plug in a search and expect it to be perfect. And it's going to change as you go based on the terms that you decide to use and find. Another trick to know that's really important is anytime you have multiple words, you want a phrase like this, putting quotations is what's going to group it together as a phrase. So I am not looking for the word divide off on its own or inequality off on its own, because that's a very broad topic, right? But I paged down on accident. Digital inclusion is a very specific phrase. The word inclusion on its own is going to find lots of things that have nothing to do with my topic. So the quotes force it to find this phrase exactly. In some of my classes, I talk about like using President Bush In quotes, you'll find the individual, the administration. Without quotes, you're going to find presidents from other countries and stuff on like gardening and shrubbery. So just keep in mind quotation marks help with that. Other terms for COVID, you can see that it's giving me suggestions because it knows this is the best way to run a search. We might say COVID, we might say coronavirus, we might say pandemic. There was another one I was thinking of earlier. That's all right, we can leave it, it's an example. And then for libraries, we've got libraries, or in the field, sometimes they're called media centers, or information literacy, words in the field. Again, knowing your field is the key here. The last trick I want to talk about is an asterisk. Finding and using an asterisk lets you find alternate endings. So using library with an asterisk there at the end is going to find both the singular library and also the plural libraries, and also the people that work in libraries, librarians. So again, just something to keep in mind. This is really common for plurals. Unfortunately, a lot of academic searches won't find plurals. So if there's an S at the end, just chop the S off, add an asterisk, and then you'll find both the singular and plural. Yes, Christy, I had used, raise your hand. So question.
I see an answer. I raised my actual hand. I see a question I don't know the answer to. Does the or have to be capitalized?
The answer to that is yes and no. In this particular iteration, no. But some of the databases that the libraries have access to haven't been updated in a really long time, and they're not quite in the 20th century yet. So the or lets the search know that you're not actually looking for the word or. That would be, crazy. It would be in everything. We're using it as this combination. They're called Boolean operators, but we're using it as this function rather than as a term we're searching for. In most databases, most places you search realize you're not looking for the words and and or, but there are the occasional old clunky databases that you come across. So it's a habit that I use just because you never know when you'll run across one. So I'm going to run my search. We're going to find a ton of results because we've added all these synonyms in, right? So if we didn't have all these synonyms, if I just had digital divide, COVID, and libraries, I would find materials, but I wouldn't find much. It wouldn't be comprehensive. So lots of ways we can narrow this down. I've got not quite 3,000, but we're closing in there. That's a lot. It's not too much if you're doing a comprehensive systematic review because you're not going to keep all of them, but there are ways to narrow this down from the get-go. So don't get overwhelmed. One would be to narrow to peer-reviewed articles. That's a pretty common option. And this is going to get rid of things like newspapers and lesson plans and ebooks and things like that. The other one is the date range. Since I'm specifically looking at the COVID pandemic, I really only need materials from 2020 on. The stuff from 2000 on is going to be looking at previous pandemics, and I'm not. All right, my mouse jumped a little bit there. So if I actually slide that over to do the correct date range that I was looking for, 2020 on, update, we've got about 600 articles. This is a very reasonable number to work with. And I know it seems like it might be a lot, but 600 for a systematic review is going to be a really reasonable number, honestly, because you're not going to keep them all. My exclusion criteria might say I'm only looking at the United States response because the digital divide and socioeconomics in the United States are unique and different from what you would find in South America or Europe or in another continent or country. So that's something to keep in mind. Couple things here that I do want to point out really quickly. Sometimes you'll see the PDF full text. That's pretty straightforward. You click on it, you get the article. Sometimes you'll see this full text finder. If you're on campus, that's going to look like a brown button that says find it at MU. And that is going to redirect you to where you can access the article. It's really just a difference of which vendor sold it to us. So they make theirs look pretty. So you click on theirs and their numbers go up when we buy more for them. When you do use this full text finder, I do want to click this real quick because this is my nemesis. Sometimes it takes you straight to the article. And sometimes instead you get a broken page link. I don't know if it's going to do it here, or it just doesn't do anything. And you get this banner across the top that says to open the page in a new window. Click the banner. I don't know why it forces you to do that extra click, but it does. And it makes it seem like you don't have access when you actually do. So keep an eye out for that banner across the top of the page. That is how you will get your PDF. But you do have access. And if ever MU doesn't have access, it will take you to a page where you can request it through interlibrary loan. And all of that is, of course, completely free for you. And it's pretty fast. Most articles are electronic now. So it's a straightforward process of saying, can I have it? We email another library that does, and you might have the article within an hour. So it's pretty quick. You can go through and look at these on an individual level, but what I usually do if you're trying to be comprehensive, so for that systematic review or dissertation, is at this point export the whole search. This looks different in each database, but you'll usually see a share option where you can export the entire list of results at once, or sometimes you'll have an export button. And you'll want to export everything that you find in the list, because then you can organize and keep track and say like, well, my original search resulted in 599 articles, and then I got rid of the duplicates and I only had 400, and then I got rid of the ones that weren't in the United States and I only had 300. Obviously, I'm making up numbers at this point, but this is where you start keeping track. Your exclusion of peer review, your exclusion of date range left you with this starting point. So keeping track of all of those is really useful, and I do that in a citation management tool, which we'll take a look at in a second. So exporting the entire thing to your citation management tool really, I think, helps with the organizational piece. The other thing that I want to look at is you can go into these individually. If you click on the title, you get more information, abstracts, things like that. And you also get this nifty toolbar on the right side. The URL at the top of the page does not work if you send it to yourself. It's based on the single time you've logged in. And so it doesn't go through the proxy server. It doesn't recognize you as an MU person, which is frustrating. So the permalink option here in the toolbar at the very bottom will create a URL that does go through the proxy server and works consistently if you send it to yourself or someone you're collaborating with. So make sure proxy server link is the one you use. It also has a cite button. So if you're going individually and looking at articles, this is a great tool. But again, if you're exporting it to a citation management tool, it's going to write your bibliography for you, so you don't need to do this part. The other thing I want to touch on really quickly is we do have this really cool new tool that we are starting to work with at MU. It's called Power Notes. And Power Notes is an organization tool that lets you, while you're in a PDF, take notes, annotate, and have it saved. It grabs a citation for you. So you can kind of see this as a browser extension. I'm going to turn it on at this point because I've had it turned off so far. It shows up as this yellow P at the bottom of my screen. And now I can have it big or small. Sorry, go back, be small. Sorry, my mouse froze. Here we go, go be small again. But now when I'm in an article, if I highlight text, it's gonna let me send it to that organizer. It's gonna let me take notes, and then it's gonna export it into an organization file that I can turn into a Microsoft Word document. So it makes writing a review really easy. What I like for this tool specifically is the systematic review application. So when you're writing a systematic review, you usually have a table and a chart that's like, here are my articles and the demographics and the methodology and the outcomes. And as I go through an article, as I'm reading it the first time, I can highlight things and send them into those columns. And so I can export it into an Excel spreadsheet as well as exporting it into a Word document. So I can create the table while I'm reading the articles. I don't have to go back and forth and bounce between screens. It's very seamless and an easy transition. So I'm not going to talk too much about that because Christy and I are doing a workshop on that next week and next Thursday. But just so you know, that is a really cool tool that can help with this whole writing process as well. And I really think it helps generate the writing while you're doing the research, as opposed to doing the writing and then trying to find research that fits. Okay. So I talked a little bit about citation management tools, and I'm going to hop over to my other tab. I use Mendeley. A lot of my colleagues use Zotero. I think they're both great tools to use. It's really depending on the citation formats you need. When I started working, Mendeley had the option of having a web browser version. So there's a version that lives on my desktop, and then there's a version that is a web page. So I can access this on any computer. I don't have to be on my computer. And that's why I picked Mendeley originally. Zotero's caught up now. They both have that function. So it kind of works like Google Docs. You could access it anywhere. And I just wanted to point out kind of some of the structure that I've used when doing a systematic review, because again, you want to be really comprehensive in it. So this example is a review that I was working on recently, looking at human trafficking and domestic violence. And a lot of survivors of human trafficking wind up in domestic violence shelters, even though the needs aren't the same. And that's kind of the point of the review. So you can see from the search results, we have like all of our results, but then we also broke it down by our exclusion criteria. We weren't looking at healthcare, but there were a ton of articles on healthcare. So I have a whole folder full of the healthcare articles that we didn't include, because then when I'm doing my write-up and I'm writing my methodology, I can say, well, originally we found 1,000 articles and we went through them and 90 of them were on healthcare. So we didn't include those. And you can kind of see some of my criteria here, my exclusion criteria. So when I'm writing it up, you can do that flow chart that's required for a systematic systematic review or for a dissertation sometimes, and say, here are the articles that I kept, and then here's the articles I didn't keep and why. And there are forms that make this much easier. Prisma is a really common one for systematic reviews, and those also tie into assessment. So it is a requirement often when you're writing a systematic review that you have a tool of assessment where you're looking at an article and you're looking at it for quality and saying like, okay, their methodology stacks up, the information is valid. It's not just a peer review checkbox, but I went through and I did my due diligence and I know that this article is trustworthy. So there's a lot of different assessment tools that can be used, and I've got a list of them here. And if you email me afterward, I'm happy to share this list with you. These are the ones I've come across the most frequently. Prisma is probably the most common one that I see. It's used in the social sciences a ton, in the sciences too. CASP is a usual suspect as well. And I think that this is one people like because it's a Creative Commons license. So you can change it a little bit if there's something specific in your research that you want to adapt. Like if you want to add an extra criteria to say like, in my field, this is really important. So did they or did they not include this piece? So CASP and Prisma are the two that I see the most frequently. And they both also have those flow charts where you would say, if you're doing your methodology for systematic review, here's what I found, here's why I excluded things, and here's the end number of results that I'm actually analyzing. So, okay, that's a lot of different pieces going back and forth, but we talked about searching, talked about using a citation management tool to keep track, and then assessment tools to both assess those articles that you are keeping track of and explain why you might use or might not use something. So the last piece that I'm going to pull up here, coming back to our slide deck, and I'm going to go present this, is the anatomy of a scholarly article. We talked about how the first section is always that literature review background. Well, the second section is always, well, okay, 95% of the time, I'm making up that statistic, but I think that's pretty close. Most of the time, your first section is going to be literature review. Your second section is going to be methodology, which again, for systematic review is, here's the search I ran, here's where I ran it, here's what I found, and here's what I used. Your third section is going to be results. So like, okay, I ran that search, here's what I found. And then the fourth section is going to be your discussion/conclusion. And I want to point this out because you can save yourself a lot of time and energy by at the beginning skipping down to the conclusion. Anytime you're reading an article, go to the conclusion first. It's not how we're usually taught to read, like start at the beginning, go to the end, but it is how you want to read an academic article because the conclusion is really going to wrap up and summarize what the rest of the article says. So if the conclusion is useful for your research, then you're going to dig more into those other pieces and you're going to look at the literature review, you're going to look at the methods and see if it's a quality study. But if the conclusion isn't useful for your research, then you don't have to waste your time going through the rest of it. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Christy. And it looks like we've had a lot in the chat. So
yes, I answered the things I knew how to answer and ignored the rest. So you might want to scroll back through. There are a few technical questions in there I wasn't sure about. So as you've perhaps figured out, I am the writing person of our team. So my academic background is in writing. My PhD is in English education. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we do after the search. So as I put in the chat, Kimberly and all of her librarian colleagues are so helpful in figuring out how to make searching efficient and less frustrating. It can be a really frustrating process. And so I highly recommend you reach out to them. My work is really thinking about how to make writing efficient and a less frustrating process. And so I want to bring to you a few highlights from the literature and the work that I do, just so that you can think about maybe a more effective way to start the writing process. So I've been really taken by this book by Harris. Harris is a rhetorician, and he talks about how we should really approach reading things. So as Kimberly mentioned, when we read an academic article, we don't read from beginning to end. You're never going to get through those articles, especially if you're an undergraduate or an emerging researcher where you just don't have the background to make it through quickly, right? And so Harris says that not only should we read in the way that Kimberly suggests, reading the abstract and maybe the conclusion and then jumping around to what's useful, but we should also think about texts as projects. And that is as something that's this big, complex sort of project, not a single main idea. So if I'm reading an article, I might say, okay, so this article has this finding. How does that fit in the projects that this author has been experiencing? So I know that this scientist does work around this topic. How does this article fit within there? What we don't want to have is these discrete little sort of facts or findings and not know how to put them together into a more sort of global thing. Harris also tells us that texts aren't simply these pieces of writing that reveal their meanings to us, but really we take our own past experiences, our own expertises, our own content areas to the text. And in doing so, when we read text, we're going to read them a little bit differently than if a colleague down the way in our office reads the text. So we all get different main ideas out of a text. We all find different things interesting. So just recognizing that reading isn't a sort of one size fits all process. Another colleague that I really like is Peg Smith or Boyle Single. I always call her Smith. I don't know why. And we just ordered this book in the library. That is an ebook, and multiple readers can read it at the same time. So I highly recommend it. I will tell you that Peg is from the humanities, so it skews more to a humanities sort of approach. But the section on interactive reading is really valuable, and I use it in a lot of classes I teach. And so here are sort of her tips on interactive reading. She tells us the first thing you want to do is when you find an article, you found it, it's going to be part of your systematic review, is to pre-read that text with a pencil. So take a pencil and flip through the text or scroll through the text on your computer and focus on the big picture. I don't know about you, but I have had lots of times where I read a whole article and I take really tedious notes and I'm like, that doesn't really fit anything at all. And I've wasted all my time on reading this article, right? So really doing that pre-reading to make sure that it fits in what I want it to fit into and make sure it fits the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And it fits all of these ideas that you're trying to sort of grasp. Then she recommends that when you take notes, you engage in a conversation with the author. And so this is why she's anti-highlighter. A highlighter is a passive action, right? When we're highlighting, all we're thinking is like, oh, I'm highlighting this sentence. Oh, I went too far, right? We're not doing any sort of actual processing or meaning making. And so we really want to read with a pencil or with an annotation tool like Power Notes and engage in a conversation with the author. So thinking about the projects or the main points, but also noticing how the author reports other research and their own research. So for example, engineers might use the verb show, while philosophers might use the verb think, and biologists might describe, and linguists might suggest, right? All of these verbs are doing different things. We wouldn't have an engineer building our bridge and thinking that this might work, right? That would not be a thing we'd want to do. And so as we're reading for these projects or these main points, we also want to see how the language is sort of reporting what's going on in the studies, because that's different among different fields. So more tips for interactive reading from Peg Boyle Single. She really has a very structured, formal process. And the reason she has this is she wants to be able to reproduce it quickly and to look back at things she read 5 years ago and have the same process. So if you're just starting a research project or if you're just starting grad school, I highly recommend finding a really structured, sort of systematic process for reading articles. It does not have to be hers, but it has to be one that works for you. And so hers is this. She reads through the text and she puts one set of 3 stars. And that one set of 3 stars is the main argument or the main project that this is getting at. And she only puts 1 because she wants to be able to flip through the article and find that main argument so she can sort it into categories later or to themes or however she wants to organize her writing. She also lists H1 and H2 for specific hypotheses, if that's something that you do in your discipline. I know not all disciplines are hypothesis-based research. And so she also puts TH to note theory. I'm a social scientist and theory is very important in our research. And so whenever I see a theory being discussed, I make sure to note that because at some point I want to go back and think, who used this theory versus who used that theory and how did that affect their outcomes? She also puts a Q and underlines a useful quotation. I don't know about you, but I've often underlined things in books and then gone back and been like, why did I underline that? So she always puts a little code, right? This is a quote I wanted to use, or this is something to look up later, or something to know why you underline that. So it's not just a, oh, this is a random underline. And then, of course, noting question marks for maybe words that she's unsure of or ideas she's unsure of, or things to critique or follow up on. So you notice that this sort of key for reading is short, it's easily reproducible, it works on most articles and books. And as she gets, faster at doing this, it becomes sort of like the way she approaches the reading of her texts. Okay, so we've talked about finding texts, we've talked about reading texts, and now we're like, how do I organize all this information? I remember towards the end of my dissertation, my office at home was just covered with like stacks of things. And I was like, what am I ever going to do? How am I going to get all this out, right? Well, I suggest, this is my most favorite soapbox, that everyone should use concept maps in whatever way you find useful. And here is why I think that people should use that. Concept maps allow writers to translate difficult text into their own words. It is not fun, I'll agree with Kimberly, it is not fun to read these research texts sometimes, but we really have to get them into our own language, get them into our own schema to be able to remember them, which is step one, and then write about them, which is step two. And so as we're making concept maps, we're distilling down these big main ideas into little phrases or into very short sentences. The thing about concept maps that are especially useful for literature reviews is that they make these themes and these main ideas clear without having to highlight everything in the text. So it really pulls out the main idea and the connections, and we can start to see how the themes are falling out. The interesting thing about the way I do concept maps is I physically draw lines to create connections. And so it really helps with organization, which is the biggest challenge for me in my writing. Whoops. And then the other thing is it highlights disciplinary jargon and knowledge. So we'll see that as we go throughout here. So a couple examples. This is actually right behind me, right back there by my plant. This is my organizing graphic for my comps process. So it's a big piece of paper. And I wrote every one of the 400 books that I read or in articles for comps. I wrote in here and I wrote the name and the main ideas, and you can't see it because I should have used a marker that wouldn't have faded, but there are yellow lines that are connecting all these ideas, and there are themes written on those yellow lines. So I use this concept map to help organize a lot of reading. This is really the bare bones, like this is what you have to know to have a PhD in English Ed. So that's big and messy. Something that's more useful probably for your literature review process is organizing thoughts for the first draft. So if we check out a book from the library, or if we read online, we can't write in the book, right? We're trying to make friends with librarians, so we don't want to do that. And so what I do is use those small Post-it notes, those ones that are like the 2x2, the small ones. And as I'm reading a book, I will take notes on Post-it notes and stick it in the book. And as you can see, these are different colors because they're from different books. And so the pink book was like a book about narrative methodology, and the green book was qualitative research in general, and I forget what the blue book was. And so this helps me take notes faster as I'm reading, and it also makes me take really short notes because I can't put everything on a 2x2 Post-it note. The other thing that I noticed from this is when I pull those sticky notes out of my book, two things. I make sure to put the page number on every sticky note because you think you will find it later, and I promise you, you will not. And then you'll have to cut your favorite paragraph of your dissertation, and you won't still think about that 3 years later, which is exactly what I'm doing. But also, you are able to see, or you also want to make a key. So make sure that you make a key for what color means what. And then you pull them out and you put them on here, and you can see that immediately in my first critique was, you have way too much of this teal blue text. It's not, there's way too much of that. There's only one of this darker blue text. It's not balanced. So you can kind of see that quickly. You also can carry out real revisions. So when your literature review is done and you're ready to start revising, you can physically cut things apart and put them together. This is one of my students' concept maps when she early on was doing a review of critical literacy. So this is just note-taking as she's working through what these words sort of mean. Okay, so here's best practices in my mind of concept maps. They take the place of an outline. So you're not getting yourself anywhere if you make a detailed concept map and then you make a detailed outline, because you're doing the same thing twice. In my world, I write directly from the concept map. So I'll write directly from one bubble, that'll be a section, and directly from another bubble, and I'll write that section. So it takes the place of an outline for me. I like paper. I need to be able to manipulate it. I'm just an old soul in that way, but there are lots of computer programs. I see that there's a comment in the chat. We'll get back to that. I will show you my favorite computer program that's free and super easy here in just a second. The key here really though is to start grouping content and main ideas by theme. We'll talk about why that's important later. I also think it's important to put things in boxes, connect the boxes so you can start to see sort of the buckets that your research is falling into. And then don't forget to include citations for any content you pull because you won't find it later. Okay, so my favorite concept map tool right now is Jamboard. Does anyone use Jamboard? It's from Google. It is literally like a big wall with sticky notes. And so this is what it looks like when one's filled in. I actually use this with my students. They turn in a Jamboard instead of an essay, which is kind of fun, makes them think differently. So you can make all kinds of sticky notes. You can move them around. You can collaborate. You can see up here at the top that you can have multiple slides. So you can have like, here's for this theme and here's for that theme. I love this because I love Google anyway. I use Google all the time, and it makes it really easy for me to translate from reading to making my concept map to writing later on. So I highly recommend that is Jamboard. I will put it in the chat, jamboard.google.com, and it's part of the Google suite. Oh, I put it here for you, apparently. I've forgotten I put it. Okay, so we have a concept map, this big messy thing, and then we have to start writing. This is one tip I would like to share as well, that at some point you have to start writing and you will never feel like it's time to start writing. So you just have to start writing. That's the best way to get it done, right? We know that the hardest thing for a lot of emerging researchers is to think about structure and organization. So there are three sort of main ways to organize a literature review. Chronological will trace a topic through time. This might be useful if it's a topic where time really matters. So for example, maybe like the teaching of evolution in schools. Maybe I really want to see like the trends of when it started and where we are now and what happened, in between. The trend organization will break the topic into subsections that really highlights the shift. So the shift of, oh, ideas changed here or ideas changed here. But the most popular for, I will venture to say all disciplines, is by theme. And that's really, okay, I've read all of these topics, or I read all this research, I figured out the main ideas from all these research, and now I've organized this into a new structure, one that I created myself, to highlight the trends and the big ideas. This really does the work for the reader. This shows that you understand how everything fits together. So thematic is really preferred. And some ways to get it synthesis rather than summary. So another challenge we sometimes see with folks new to literature reviews is there's lots of summary, right? And the key really is to just have the amount of summary that gets to the main idea you want, and really organizing that via synthesis. And so you might have one section where you describe and define something. So maybe you synthesize a bunch of pictures or papers together to say, this is the picture of X topic, and here are the key features, right? That would be one type of synthesis. Maybe your work, it's important to compare and contrast. I see this a lot in engineering where folks are thinking about different models or different, approaches to a certain problem. So they might describe each of the approaches and sort of show how they're similar and different. Most often I see, and again, this is because I'm a social scientist, is where folks analyze specific pieces or specific parts of the research and then put them together into what Roy Fox calls a new or different whole. So really breaking down to pieces, putting it together and say, this is the piece that's useful for my research. There are many resources on literature reviews. Not many of them are that great, in my opinion. I read a lot of these. These are the 4 that I used for my class, and the library owns all of them. So I'm happy to say the Boyle single book is an ebook. The other ones, I believe, are print books. And most of these come out of the UK for some reason. I don't know why the UK is ahead of us on writing textbooks, but they are. I will say one thing that's useful for everyone is this Sylvia text. He is a social scientist, a psychologist. He's hilarious, and his tips are really practical and useful. So in this particular book, he wrote How to Write a Lot, if you know that book. In this particular one, he goes through the sections of a paper and says, this is really how you can put together the introduction. This is how you put together the methods, etc. I find that pretty useful. Kimberly.
Yes, so we are closing in on the end of our time here, but we do want to point out that you're not alone in this process. So as you're going about writing, you have a lot of resources on campus, and some of those are things like the library building itself and resources, but there's also a lot of people who are on campus to help you go through this process. So the first picture there on the left is of Ellis Library. That's where I work. And it's where you're going to find the majority of librarians, although there are libraries all over campus. And I want to point this out because I mentioned that I have written and co-authored systematic reviews with a number of faculty. If you want help and you want to go through that process of creating a search string, of doing the methodology with a librarian, that's normal. That's actually a really common thing that happens. And so don't feel like if you're asking for that help that it's any sort of a negative thing. That's actually the professional way to do it. So reach out to us, ask for help. The middle picture there is of the Campus Writing Center, which is, I think their tagline is that they won't write your paper for you, but they will help you through it. So they aren't going to go line by line and like check commas and check grammar, but they will help you structure themes and organize. And if you're struggling to figure out how you want to organize your paper, they're a really great resource to talk to. And they both will meet in person for consultations, and they have online consultations where you can submit your paper and they'll give you feedback. And then that third building is where Christy, I shouldn't say lives, should I? Where Christy lives. It's the Conley House, the campus writing program. And it's really geared toward helping graduate students and faculty with writing and publishing. And I don't know if you want to talk about that, Christy.
Yeah, so we're here coming to you from the Conley House now at 6th and Conley, right by the Turner parking garage. And I put my program's events in the chat box. So we don't help you with your specific paper you're working on, but we support the ways that you teach with writing or the ways that you engage as writers. So you'll see in the events, we have writing retreats, which are times where there's no programming, we don't talk to you, we come together and write. So that's really generative, especially for dissertation writing. And then the other thing we're doing this year is a series on Google. And so you'll see that as well. If Jamboard was interesting to you, we're going to have a workshop on that. So feel free to check it out.
And then the last thing on this page is MoSpace, which is our campus's institutional repository, which is a fancy way of saying the stuff that you publish and that MU people publish gets put into MoSpace and makes it freely accessible to the world. For dissertations and theses, they all go in MoSpace. And you then can find them on Google Scholar, and people can access the work that you've spent so much time creating. It's really great for conference presentations as well. This isn't just restricted to dissertations or article publications. If you want to have a consistent URL that you don't have to worry about, we put it up in MoSpace, and then you can add it to a resume and have people look at, again, around the world. The other nice thing about this is it's not behind a paywall. So for anything you're looking at publishing, any article, no matter where you're publishing it, the journal often holds copyright to the final product, the PDF, the thing that's like fancy in terms of how it's been organized and with images, but you usually retain copyright to the original manuscript, the Word document. So we can work with you on author rights and copyright and put up that original manuscript in MoSpace. So then when someone searches Google Scholar and they find your article and they hit that paywall, they'll also have the option of using the original text. And so again, makes your research much more available, much more widely used. For those of you thinking about promotion and tenure, it makes it cited more. So definitely a good resource to know about.
And I will say that if you're writing a dissertation literature review, it's super useful to go in there and search by advisor or search by program area and read a literature review that was actually in a dissertation where the person graduated. Very useful.
Yes, it helps you look at the vocabulary, what terms are used in your field, and also just see like, what does the format look like that they expect? What font should be used? So this final slide, future learning opportunities. We talked a bit about the Power Notes one, as Christy mentioned in the chat. It is full, unfortunately, because it is an in-person session, but it's been so popular, we're going to offer it again. So stay posted. If you want to know future dates for that, please email one of us and ask, and we'll make sure to let you know when it comes up. We're also going to be recording the demo part. It's going to be more hands-on, so there'll be a demo part and also hands-on part. We're going to record the demo part, and we can send that to you if you're off campus. And then the Teach and Learn with Google Suites, Christy mentioned. And I don't know, Christy, do you want to talk about the class as well?
I will. I'm trying to pull up our slides in a different window so I can put them in the chat so folks can click on these links as well. So that's coming. Don't leave yet. So the Google Suite tools, if you go to my website that I put in the chat earlier, cwp.missouri.edu, last year we did an overview of all of the Google tools that are super useful. We recorded those. You can watch them on our website. This year, the Google Suite tools work that we're going to do is sort of a make and take. So we'll be like, hey, here are cool ways you can do it. Let's make one of these so you can take it into your class or your research and have some sort of outcome.
And then the last thing on this slide is the STAR program. This is specifically a program for undergrads. So if you're an undergrad attending this session, this is for you. And the STAR recognition program is just if you attend 5 professional development workshops that the Office of Undergraduate Research or partners have put on, you get a small gift. And it's a great resume builder. So it's like a certificate that you get to put on your resume, as well as a gift from the university. So if you're interested in the STAR program and you would like to know more, you can either email me, indicate in the chat that you want credit for it, and I'll contact the head of the STAR program, or the STAR program email is on that as well. So again, if you're an undergrad and you want credit for the STAR program, put it in the chat or send an email to the UGR email on the screen.
And can I also quickly mention my class? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So for years, we've been asked to, graduate students would love a class about academic writing. And so I had the opportunity to create one, and I've taught it 3 times now, I believe. It is a spring semester course. It's in the evenings. And it really is a class that is meant to support your writing that you're already doing in your discipline. So you take the writing that you need to be doing for your lab work and you bring it to my class and we workshop it and work on it together. And I put the flyer in the chat as well.
Okay, so I think then we are almost out of time, but do you have any last questions for us? And please feel free to email either of us again. I'm going to throw my email in the chat so that you have that. But feel free to let us know if you have questions about literature reviews, about searching, or about anything else about research and writing. Okay, and I am writing down the people's names. Just get an actual piece of paper and write this down so it doesn't disappear with the chat. I'm going to stop the recording at this point as well. Recording.